Hello again, this is Hellkrai. Right now, there's a fun trend in indie games of making books. 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 Let me take you back to the mysterious year of 2004. As a dorky 9-year-old, I had lots of interests. There was a whole new wave of Bionicles with completely new design, with a completely new series of comic books to read. I had found in a bookstore a huge comic book of the sequel to my favorite anime. Around this time, one of my friends was really into Halo, and I found out they had a book series on it. I wasn't super into it, but I found it fascinating. Fast forward to about 2011, after struggling with a launch Xbox 360, my family eventually got a newer model that didn't have any real issues. And at this point, was definitely the height of me getting into gaming. Going out of my way to purchase a bunch of used games that I'd been interested in. One of which being BioShock, as I was told it was one of the greatest games on the system. After beating it and absolutely falling in love with it, I'd found out that there was a book that takes place before the game and tells the story of Andrew Ryan creating this mystical underwater city. Fast forward to 2014, and a little indie game called Five Nights at Freddy's comes out. You know what Five Nights at Freddy's is. Don't pretend you don't. Basically, my interest in Five Nights at Freddy's was not playing it. I had a great time specifically watching Markiplier play it. To me, it looked like a really complicated game that looked stressful at its core, but because of its game mechanics made it a really fun game to watch other people play, and even hear your friends' stories of triumphing over it. Even without touching it, I immediately understood the entire appeal. Tricky skill game that rewards you for learning the nuances of it, charming mascot character, background details, hidden secret. Why the series was a massive success isn't unknown to anyone. In this, eventually, it led to a series of books.
Oh, but look at this library, guys. Holy.
Now, I will be 100% honest with you. I have never read any of the books. Never. My interest in Five Nights at Freddy's is actually pretty limited. I find the storytelling fun, and the characters great. More so, I just really enjoyed watching people play the games and overcome the challenge. I personally had very little interest in the challenge itself. And to be honest, I wasn't invested in the story of the games until Sister Location because it was story focused. And then I became truly fascinated at the storytelling in these games with Help Wanted, and then was interested in the gameplay of Security Breach. I was never a super fan of FNAF, and more so, I've had a lot of fun talking about the games with my friend Linguistic Spaceship than most of the things around the game. And after a while, I had a particular fixation. Focused on how obsessed the people who made videos were with these books. I had, before knowing of any book, before watching any theory about it, already came to the conclusion personally that I believed Gregory, the main character of Security Breach, could have been a beta tester on FNAF Help Wanted, the VR game, in universe, and that could have led to him being brainwashed. I would later be vindicated by the books, proving that my theory was correct. However, I would also be told by FNAF theorists like Jonathan FNAF.
Exactly, and I think it's frustrating for me because people could say, oh yeah, you could have easily figured out Gregory's patient 46, but I think the people who figured out Gregory was patient 46 when Security Breach came out, it was basically just guessing. It was basically just guessing.
That my correct reading of the presentation of the game was nothing more than a guess. And I would be told by every FNAF theorist ever in their videos and several people throughout the internet that there would be no way to have guessed this, or even make a solid suggestion of it without this book. And today is where we get into my problem.
But nowadays, all these indie horror franchises, they're basically asking us to do homework, because to understand anything in this pilot, or honestly the recent games, you have to have read the 1,400 pages spread across their 7 books.
The examples I brought up earlier weren't fluff or to do a little bit of storytelling. No, they're examples I'm referencing again in my childhood. Still, one of my favorite series is the .hack franchise, this massive multimedia project that inspired me in my youth. And in some ways, it acts as a perfect example of what I'm referring to when I'm talking about that you don't need the books. The beginning of the franchise is a light novel titled AI Buster, followed by an anime titled Sign, followed by a series of games, Infection, Mutation, Outbreak, Quarantine, and then is capped off with a manga, Legend of the Twilight. This is the R1, or the first series of the story, and that's titled that because it's revision 1 of the game that they play. Later on, there's a light novel series that takes place even further before this, and there's obviously stuff that takes place after this. But if we just focus on these pieces of this massive franchise, we have a literal book, an animated series, a video game, and a comic book series. Despite the fact that you can't respond, and I usually despise the sort of breaking the fourth wall to talk to you, the viewer, yourself, I'm going to rhetorically ask you, how much of this do you think that you need to know about to experience any piece individually? If your answer is none, congratulations, you are correct.
Wonderful!
Each of these stories are separate stories that play into a grander, overarching narrative. These events take place in a timeline, and the stories reflect this, with certain characters showing up at different parts in the stories, and even certain events happening across the entries. But at the core of it, the .hack series is about the characters themselves. The story of Tsukasa in .hack Sign is, in my opinion, a masterpiece, and you don't need to know anything else to enjoy that and appreciate it. You might not know the exact context of why what is happening is what is happening, but you don't need to. Tsukasa doesn't even know why what is happening is what's happening. And this is similar with everything I mentioned. The Bionicle comics are irrelevant to the enjoyment of these toys. It's cool, I liked reading them as a kid, and I'm sure they hold up and have things that are interesting about them, but really, it's just another entry in Bionicle as a franchise. It's another way for you to appreciate the cool character designs. And with BioShock, you really don't need to know the nuanced story of Andrew Ryan's insane idea of building this impossible city under the water. It's not at all really relevant to the game. It's cool to know about, sure, but you don't really need to read this book to enjoy the story that's in the game. And lastly, let's not ever pretend like Halo was a bastion of storytelling. One of the most interesting stories of the novels got adapted into a game anyway. These books aren't enemies, and they're not things to retcon stories. They are new entries in the franchises we love. They are new experiences and new stories from a world that had captivated you before. And I really want to stress something. They are not homework.
They're basically asking us to do homework.
Matthew Patrick, I know you're leaving soon, and I know that your friends agree with the sentiment, but you just labeled reading books as homework? I thought the mission statement of game theory was to get people more interested in the stories that exist in games and media as a whole.
They were all here because we all had a similar goal, to educate people through the lens of gaming.
And to think about it on a deeper level, but you just told everyone that books are homework. And people repeat this at me, and I'm sure there's people already typing up comments about how much they hate the books. I don't care. Labeling a form of media, a form of art that is made to be enjoyed as if it's homework is honestly sad. It takes the joy out of the art form, and it's anti-intellectualism at its finest. You can be critical about the way that the games do its storytelling, even though it's thanks to the way that those games do their storytelling that you have such a successful career, on top of why they're so beloved. The issue is taking the stance that the overarching story is something that must be understood for the average person to enjoy the game is completely overlooking the storytelling that exists within the games itself. Going back to the very first entries of the Five Nights at Freddy's story, the game has nothing to do with the background quote-unquote lore. And it's 100% about your journey. You, as the player, trying to survive your 5 nights at Freddy Fazbear's Pizzeria. Wow, that's almost like the title of the game. But instead, you get lost. You're so focused on all the forest details, the overarching plot, the story of William Afton, that you need to somehow contextualize every other piece into this grand puzzle and tell others this is the story of the thing, when half the time you're not even right, and the other half the time it's not even what most people experience when they're playing the game. It's frankly disingenuous about the nature of storytelling and the nature of these games themselves. And by calling it homework, you've given millions of children a new excuse not to read a book. And I think that's truly tragic.